And we're very lucky that we're welcoming today the Reverend Charlene Belsom Zellmer, a new and good friend of mine, right from the neighborhood, although she grew up in New Orleans. And just by way of her background, she's got a bachelor's in special ed, and she's worked with youth and adolescents who are challenged. She's got an MDiv from Wesley Theological Seminary, and she's worked as a hospital chaplain and a hospice chaplain. But the reason she's here today is because of her current iteration at the Unitarian Universalist Church on Cedar Lane, where she works as a passionate immigrant advocate, justice proponent, and she works on the sanctuary team there. As you may recall, Unitarian Universalist Church on Cedar Lane has been hosting a sanctuary guest since last December. Charlene is one of the members of the team that's supporting that family, and I know we'll hear more about that today. She also works and represents Montgomery County on a group called the Congregation Action Network. Has anybody heard of this group? It's new, got started I think around 2017. It encompasses quite a number, 90 or something, faith congregations from all ecumenical interfaith around the DMV area, and they work on immigrant justice issues, and she is the representative for Montgomery County there. And today we're going to ask her to talk to us a little bit about that work and what is justice in the context of the immigrant situation, immigrant and refugee situation in the US. Did I cover it all?
Pretty good, okay. Pretty good. Although I didn't grow up in New Orleans.
Oh, sorry, you said you loved the music of your childhood.
I love the music, but I grew up in the bayous of South Louisiana in a small fishing village called Barataria. Anybody been there?
Well, the music of New Orleans was there. That's
the music in New Orleans was everywhere, right?
Okay, well, thank you so much for being here today.
It's a delight,
We're eager to hear from you, please.
Yes. I am scripted this morning because I'm really verbose. It came before ministry, so I have an excuse. And so I'd like to share with you some notions about what it means to seek justice through sanctuary, immigrant rights, and the notion that not all of us in our midst are free or ever will be. I want you to think for a moment about how you got here today. Our paths to this place today were relatively comfortable, weren't they? I'll bet that most of you ate a delicious, well-balanced meal in the comfort of your homes. And then you either drove or walked here on quiet paths or well-paved streets. And then you gathered in this amazingly beautiful place, this place for you, which is sanctuary. Our right to be here, having long ago been granted, allowed all of us the privileges that come with freedom of movement. For it is the urge to move that is deeply within all of us. Humans have always moved from their nomadic beginnings as hunters and gatherers, and through their agrarian roots as farmers, ranchers, and fishers, to the present explorers of the universe and the World Wide Web. Sadly, though, geopolitical boundaries have restricted human migration for many reasons. The acquisition and accumulation of wealth and the impetus to build homogeneous communities have frequently created clashes amongst and between our peoples. Stringent and fickle rules limit the movement and habitation of the earth. Think about that. If you were an astronaut once upon a time and circled the earth and saw the blue-green orb, did you see geopolitical boundaries? Or did you simply see the beauty of the landmass and the water and the ice on the caps, north and south? In her 2014 book entitled Undocumented: How Immigration Became Illegal, Dr. Aviva Chomsky tells the story of human migration and the legal restrictions which have affected the lives of billions for hundreds of years. Billions for hundreds of years. A good summary of her historical timeline appeared in a January 14, 2018 op-ed by Kevin Jennings entitled, "Yes, our ancestors probably did come here legally because illegal immigration is less than a century old." Mr. Jennings reminded us that human migration is perfectly natural And it occurred routinely in this growing country so that new settlers, they freely entered and left the land as need be. In 1882, though, we enacted the first federal general immigration law. It prohibited from entering the U.S. any convict, lunatic, idiot, or any person unable to take care of himself or herself without becoming a public charge, and the Chinese. In 1882, we restricted Chinese immigration with the Chinese Exclusion Act. I'm sure you've heard of this in your American history study. The enforcement of that act led to the Federal Bureau of Immigration. This, despite the fact that the Chinese provided the labor to help build our transcontinental railroad, remember that? And many, many other things in this country, in their capable hands. We have since exploited many other worker groups whom we so callously have treated as disposable commodities. With the influx of new immigrant groups at the turn of the 20th century, which largely included Italians and Jews, a backlash led then President Coolidge to sign the National Origins Act of 1924. It severely restricted the flow of migrants from Southern and Eastern Europe. It required visas or having papers for the first time in our country's history. 1924, less than 100 years ago, the beginning of the concept of being illegal in the United States of America. Multiple laws and rulings since have shaped our immigration policies, often reversing decisions made just a decade ago. Can you imagine trying to migrate to the US and discover, as you and your caravan who've clustered together for safety, discovered that the laws and rulings changed while you were en route for 2 months? These decisions have resulted in inhumane treatment of our residents, our guest workers, our scholars. Their families have been torn apart by the vagaries of these policies. Many return to their countries of origin through forced deportation, only to be extorted under penalty of death, killed in gang-related activities, targeting whole families, or rendered poverty-stricken or homeless since they return to the same desperate situations that brought them to the United States in the first place. As Jennings, the author I referred to earlier, who is the president of the Tenement Museum in New York City, said at the end of his op-ed, "What constitutes legal immigration has been a moving target throughout our history. Americans who crow about their law-abiding ancestors may want to learn a little bit more about immigration history before wishing for a return to the good old days when pretty much anyone could come to the US legally." The notion of being legal is loaded for us. We are generous and open citizens, and I think I speak of all of you. Here in 2019, how do we respond to those who demand that our country deport 11 million of its residents who don't hold legal status, many of whom were stranded here due to our often selfish, racist, and misguided laws around residency and work? What do we do? That question and many others led me and several from 5 mostly Unitarian Universalist congregations to form a border witness delegation to Tucson, Arizona in October 2016, and another group went again in 2017. For several days, we were guided by Border Links and the Unitarian Universalist College of Social Justice, and the minister who inspired the trip, Reverend Abi Janamanchi, who is the senior minister from Cedar Lane Unitarian Universalist Church in Bethesda. Our experiences were broad and deep, funny and gut-wrenching, poignant, yet hopeful. On the first full day, we walked the Immigrant Trail. Have you ever heard of the Immigrant Trail in the Southwest? It's the trail that's often traversed by night because of desert climate. And the migrants, through word of mouth, let each other know the trail that is the easiest for them to traverse without danger, despite the fact that dangers abound. We were led by a Quaker man named John, who participated with 5 different humanitarian border groups near Tucson. This was in 2016. With his guidance and reflections, we learned about the challenging logistics of crossing this rugged landscape from Mexico into the US, about what happens to those who succeed and those who die in the efforts, about the realities of our country's policies on human lives. The turning point in our multiple-hour trail exploration came when we arrived at the first altar to the travelers, which included photo prayer cards of Charlene, a teenage girl whose life ended in that Sonoran desert. She got sick. She was 14, and her 10-year-old brother traveled together with her and a coyote. She encouraged her brother to move along since the coyote was insistent. Charlene never made it to the border, and thousands like her have died in their desperate effort to find relief in the US. Their parents sent them to purported freedom, and instead she died. Our US border is everything that is 100 miles in from our boundaries. Think about that. The US border, which can be enforced, includes this whole area. We're 100 miles in from the coast. There are hundreds of miles of border walls and fences and electronic sensors along our southern US border, particularly in Canada. You can just walk across the stream and enter and go back and forth between the borders. I understand there's more patrol now in Canada, but it's nothing like the southern border. This area near Tucson, though, is rugged and unforgiving. High desert, little potable water, hot days, cold nights, cacti, venomous creatures, vigilante raiders eager to capture immigrants. I want to repeat that, because these are people who are open carrying, riding jeeps, who've taken it upon themselves to report migrants who have crossed to Border Patrol. And they actually hold people at gunpoint until Border Patrol comes to collect them. And then there's the Border Patrol. The agents are pumped up more than ever because they've been given free rein to become more aggressive in their efforts. Once captured or presented, the potential asylum seekers or immigrants face many hardships. I'm sure you've been reading about them for quite a while now, because this is the business of the news, to share the hardships that we inflict on people who are seeking entry to our country. Sometimes their wounded feet would have been treated by the No More Deaths tent clinic deep in the desert. No Mas Muertes was established by the UU Church of Tucson decades ago to help to reduce the mortality rates of those seeking refuge in the United States. For decades, such aid groups tried to save the lives of our fellow humans, thousands of whom have died in the desert. And I said that previously, and it is thousands. Some bodies are yet to be identified, and there's a whole program started by a PhD student within the last 10 years to try to identify the remains and reconnect them with their loved ones wherever they've originated. This tent clinic, though, the humanitarian tent clinic, is regularly disrupted by these newly emboldened Border Patrol officials who have also been implicated in the destruction of salvific water and canned food, which volunteers set out along the trail. Some agents have been tried for their vandalous and inhumane acts, but as you may have heard, the humanitarian aid workers have been arrested, detained, and tried as well. We witnessed the administrative court in Tucson. It's called Operation Streamline. Have you ever heard of Operation Streamline? It's not an immigration court, it is an administrative court established in 2005 in Texas and now occurs along the border to rapidly dispose of the immigration cases of those caught at the border. The backlog is still huge. Yet, the judge rules on 70 migrants each day, most of whom plead culpable or guilty as they stand shackled at the waist and hands and feet. And they stand before the judge, having spent less than 30 minutes with legal counsel that morning. So in the morning, the 70 people have less than 30 minutes with counsel who are paid by this administrative court to provide counsel to people, and that takes a long time because of interpretation issues, because of language differences. And then in the afternoon, in groups of 6 or so, they appear before the judge shackled, plead guilty, and are sent frequently to a mandatory incarceration at many of the local, mostly privately owned and managed detention centers. Mandatory. If they haven't served enough days, they're sent back. They're not deported immediately. There's little recourse for them if they go through Operation Streamline. Private prisons drive this deportation economy. Stocks in the 2 biggest companies rose dramatically after Election Day 2016. Core Civic and Geo Group are the 2 largest private prison industries in the US. Core Civic stocks went up 140%, and Geo Group's by 98% by February 24th, 2017. The election had been the November before. Most of these people who are incarcerated, the detainees, they're young, they have few or no visitors. They've been detained about a year with an unevenly hopeful future. Many of the men we met with were LGBTQ, had no safe home awaiting them in their country of origins because of their sexual orientation. Some spoke, hopefully, about going home and then trying to enter the US through the Canadian border or seeking Canadian citizenship, because the Canadians continue to be more welcoming of the stranger. Why do these people do this? What drives them to leave their home countries to come to an increasingly hostile United States? For many, it's the lure of paid employment, which is large, especially those who are leaving strife-ridden and poverty-stricken countries. According to Reuters reporting in the last 2 years, remittances, which is the money that migrants send back to their home countries, are one of Mexico's top sources of foreign currency, alongside earnings from manufactured exports, oil, and foreign direct investment. As of October 2017, $23.9 billion were sent to Mexico from US workers in the form of remittances. Remittances also make up nearly 20% of the GDP for Honduras and El Salvador. In the case of Haiti, they account for 25% of the Haitian GDP. So there's a monetary incentive as well as safety. The motivation for some others is to migrate because they yearn for family reunification. For some, of course, getting drugs to the U.S. is their livelihood, and a lucrative one at that. The drug trade is a multi-billion-dollar industry that feeds the drug habits of Americans. Yet it's only one of the reasons that migrants cross the border, and it is one that, unfortunately, this administration hangs its hat upon: gang activity and drug transportation, rather than the millions of others who seek security and both monetary and emotional and familial in our country. We learned through our border witness preparation, which is part of what has brought me to this work, and our studies in Tucson, that 11 million undocumented people, immigrants in the U.S., are mostly law-abiding, tax-paying, hard-working members of our society. They, and especially the DACA and TPS recipients, they own property, work steadily, go to school, and rarely commit any crimes, let alone gang-related crimes. And yet ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and the Department of Justice, the DOJ, and the executive branch are all attacking these fellow inhabitants of our country. These people are our neighbors. We've come to learn over the nearly 3 years of activist work that many are in hiding for fear of deportation raids at their workplaces, such as those we experienced over the summer. Right after the inauguration, some parents kept their kids home for school for fear that there would be an immediate raid throughout the country and they would never see their children again. Desperate times called for desperate measures. ICE raids have been stepped up in recent months, as you know, the agency being emboldened by administration and judicial encouragement, and the setting of quotas for judges and agents. Other immigrants have risen above their fear, though, and are leading us as organizers in the pursuit of justice and fairness. How many of you have ever protested or gone to visuals with United We Dream? They are our leaders. They are undocumented and unafraid, and are willing to be in conversation to change our immigration laws and rulings to allow for justice and freedom and fairness. Well, a bunch of us came back to the DC area that October in 2016, and we were fired up and ready for action. We made 3 major presentations within a few months. We met with each other to continue to process the dire needs of the immigrant. We formed an immigrant justice ministry team at Cedar Lane. Once the inauguration and the Women's March were over, I'm sure many of you were there for the Women's March. We allied with dozens of congregations in the District, Maryland, and Virginia that Ann referred to. Our organization was called DMV Sanctuary Congregation Network. We changed our name to be more reflective in May to the Congregation Action Network, CAN, Si Se Puede. This is the immigrant arm of Faith in Action through its La Red program. I can discuss more about that if you're interested later. We conducted a study group using Dr. Chomsky's book, Undocumented. Several other congregations in this area have consulted with us and have modified that curriculum, which is available online for their own reflection and study over a 4-class time frame, to deal with the heritage of documentation and the current status of migration and rulings against and for the migrant in this country. We consulted with lots of congregations, and we also invited Dr. Chomsky to come to Cedar Lane to be the Kiplinger Lecture, which is an ethics lecture that Cedar Lane sponsors every year through a grant that came through the Kiplinger, Mr. Kiplinger Sr., who created this in perpetuity as a way to encourage the study and understanding of ethics. We show up. We show up at the White House. We show up at the Capitol. We are in front of ICE headquarters in Fairfax, in Baltimore, and in downtown DC. We stand with our immigrant siblings when they go for their check-ins, for their at ISAP or at ICE headquarters, and all of them face uncertain futures. We show up in the parks downtown, we're on the streets, we're at congressional offices and offices of other elected officials. Ann and I stood on the same side of the street last Friday, a week ago, as counter-protesters for protesters who were in front of 100 Maryland Avenue, which is the office of our county council. And they were protesting in favor of ICE having a greater presence in Montgomery County. Of course we countered that protest by standing in solidarity on the other side of the street with Mark Elrich, our executive, and county council members, because they are moving in the direction of fairness rather than inhumanity. Cedar Lane and 4 others have declared themselves physical sanctuary congregations. Do you know what that means? Anybody want to shout out? What's the definition of a physical sanctuary congregation? I saw a head nod. What do you? Yes. So we have a sanctuary guest. A person stays at Cedar Lane. That was a long process of discernment to move to that place. Cedar Lane has nearly 7 wooded acres. They're pretty hilly. There's a couple of big buildings on the property. Cedar Lane had the capacity to rework the programming of the congregation to provide an apartment for a sanctuary guest. And now the sanctuary guest we have has also her 3 children with her permanently. The apartment was completed in the summer of 2017. A few people asked to become a sanctuary guest at Cedar Lane. The beauty of being a physical sanctuary congregation is that we can meet with people who are afraid that they will be deported unjustly. Many of these people have pending cases, like Rosa Gutierrez Lopez, who requested sanctuary because ICE was forcing her to deport, even though she had a pending asylum case. There are many people who have her same story. We did not accept any of those requests. Well, why would that be? Wouldn't you want to, as you kind church people, open your arms and hearts and doors to people who want to take sanctuary? The reality is physical sanctuary is really hard. Physical sanctuary demands that the sanctuary guest be vocal about the guest's presence, about the guest's case. Her family life becomes a source of media interest. In the first 5 weeks Rosa was with us, she had 45 press interviews. Think about that. And she had those interviews. The first 5 weeks Rosa was with us, she had 45 press interviews from throughout the world. Every language you can imagine, sent reporters to interview her. She is the only sanctuary guest in the entire region. The closest guests to us are in Philadelphia, Charlottesville, and Richmond. And then we have Rosa and her children in sanctuary. And there's the unique nature of her being just 8 miles from the White House is a pleasant irony for us. I'm sorry, I just have to say that. So not everybody is a candidate. Well, why? Why did we turn down these people who requested sanctuary? We turned them down because guess what? They could remain in their lives and pursue their cases in the community. We continue to stay in touch with those folks through the Congregation Action Network. They continue to receive our support and resourcing and guidance and protection if they feel like they need it. But they don't have to be in sanctuary where they give up their jobs, they give up the day-to-day cadence of their lives. In Rosa's case, she gave up seeing her kids on a day-to-day basis. They were in Fredericksburg, she was here. They were coming every other weekend and for the long holidays. But these other folks who inquired, they are still pursuing their quest for justice. All of them are asylum seekers. All of them have active cases, but it's sluggish. Everything is bogged down by design. When Rosa first came to us and made her inquiry, it was 6 to 9 months that a person was spending in sanctuary. You know, we had intelligence from the rest of the country. There are about 50 people in sanctuary. We kind of know what's going on with them. And mostly people would come in, take a breath, buy the time they needed for justice to be served, and 6 to 9 months later, they could resume their lives and pursue their cases in the community. Since Rosa has been with us the last 9.5 months, people in sanctuary are spending at least 2 years in sanctuary. Think about suspending your current life for 2 years to remain in sanctuary for justice to be served. I'm way over. Enough about Rosa. I want to share with you that question which Jay and Ann asked, which is, why are you passionate about this work? And I just spent the last 20 minutes telling you about that or more. What I would like to encourage you to do is I'd like to encourage you to take the baton. I would like to pass the baton of justice seeking to all of you. There are a lot of possibilities that can come your way to help in justice seeking, and Ann and I will talk about some of those when we get together in a few minutes. Let us protect those who are in our midst until immigration laws and policies can regularize. Let us all err on the side of love and protection. Let us hold our neighbors close until the hatred subsides and sanity reigns. Let us stand by the Rosas, the Abduls, the Princes, and the Naomis, for they are many. We who have the benefit of privilege must use our power for good. So may it be.
Thank you.
Let's need a clock back there.
Yeah, we can just hop up here. Okay. Well, first of all, thank you, Charlene, for your passionate presentation of this issue. It's definitely complicated, and I'm sure that many people here have been troubled, as I have been, by recent developments with respect to immigration and refugee policy in the U.S., but also learning about our history and trying to figure out what we as people of faith can do about this. So I'd like to start by asking you the question that we're going to ask all of our participants in this forum, and that is, what in this context is justice? You mentioned it several times in your presentation, and I'd like to ask you to do it through the perspective of what you told me, that this isn't just intellectual work. This is work of the heart and the spirit. It's firmly grounded in our theology and in our faith. What is justice?
You live justice day in and day out because it's on your side. Justice is shared equanimity. Justice is an understanding that thoughts and prayers are not enough, that we cannot live above our necks. We need to move out of our heads, and we need to share that which is right and just with our brothers and sisters throughout the world. In this particular case, our siblings are threatened because they are profiled as people of color. And you, as Episcopalians, have a biblical mandate from both the Hebrew and the Christian Bible to care for the stranger, to open your hearts and your doors and your kitchens to those in need. And I'm sure Ann could quote the scriptures better than I. As an interfaith minister, the scriptural bases are wide for me, but your grounding in the Christian Bible gives you an opportunity to live your faith through just and fair acts toward the immigrant. And I believe that when we come out of our heads, we're in the DC area, right? We're in our heads a lot here. We come out of our heads and we open our hearts, then our hands will necessarily follow. And then we can enter into the work of justice seeking and justice making. And not just pray for our siblings who are struggling, but stand with them, hold hands with them, raise our arms together with them, and say, si se puede. Yes, we can finally have fair and right and just immigrant laws and policies. In the meantime, it's up to us people of faith to ask this administration to take a breath, that this persecution for political gain of people of color in this country is not the way we of faith live our lives. But we cannot simply live our lives in our houses of worship. We need to be on the street, and I welcome you all to be with us on the street.
Well, I do want to talk to you about some ways we can actually get involved, but I have to ask you this question. Last week, our rector, Sariatik, who just came in, said, made the point that what is one person's justice might be another person's oppression. It depends on how you look at it. Before I became a deacon, I was a diplomat. I worked on visa issues. I remember people in the Philippines where I served waited 10 years or more in line to get a visa to join a family member, to get it legally through the process. How do you answer those people when they say, we came here legally, why can't they? Or, we're a law-abiding country, we're a country of laws. We have to follow our laws, we have to enforce our laws. These people don't follow the law. How do you answer that?
The people are following the law. Anytime a person enters a port of entry, they are following the law and they present themselves for admission to the US. They are following the law. Anytime a person crosses our borders and asks for asylum, they are following the rubric of international law, which allows for anyone to present themselves at any border of any country around the world to seek asylum. The issue is policy, not of legality. So once people come here, we begin to create roadblocks to more than citizenship. We create roadblocks to residency. We create roadblocks to access to services. We create any number of roadblocks that make things very hard for people who have a legitimate right, a legal right, to be in this country to seek residency or protection or both. If we take a look, for instance, at the temporary protected status situation now, the TPS holders.
Does everybody know what TPS is? Maybe you should explain it briefly.
We can provide a temporary protected status for any body, and it tends to be a collective of folks who have been endangered in some way, either through war, the terrible problems of war, natural disaster, disease, and the biggest natural disaster where we brought people in the last 20, 30 years ago was drought, which of course is a natural disaster, although the jury's out on that. For instance, the biggest number of TPS holders in this country now are Salvadorans, and they fled and received temporary protected status for a number of reasons and have been here for a couple of decades. Those people are law-abiding, and they're the ones I referred to, land-holding, high office, not high office, but productive workers in our environment, in our culture. A friend of mine, Herman, is the field supervisor for one of the largest general contractors in the Washington area. He has a property in Prince George's County, drives a BMW, has a boat, and routinely supports his family in Salvador, whom he could have brought here, but his parents are too infirm to travel. That status will end, meaning that those remittances that Herman is sending back to Salvador, which boosts the Salvadoran economy, which we eviscerated in the 80s, will create a collapse, a snowballing collapse, because of the loss of the temporary protective status.
And that's a policy.
And that's a policy. And remember, you probably heard about this in relation to the Bahamians. They have been denied temporary protective status. In their country, all those islands, almost all those islands, from what I've read, have been leveled. What better opportunity to create a breath for folks to come here and with a close relationship already, in order to help rebuild their country from a distance, because there is no life to be made there now. But instead, we are denying them that status. This is extraordinarily, it's more than xenophobic, it's extraordinarily racist. The way that our country's policies are behaving with regard to other countries. Remember the Muslim ban, which was put into place the first working day of this administration?
So I would like to give you a minute to talk to us about how we can be involved, but I also want to make sure that any questions we have in the audience or comments can be solicited. So let's start. Kay, do you want to give her the microphone? Wait, Kay, we need you to speak in here so it'll be recorded. Okay, thank you. Yes.
What is the average length of time it takes for someone to legally come into the country? You know,
Ann probably knows that better than I often quote around 10 years, but can be longer, because of the quotas for certain countries. People of color wait longer, and that's around the world.
I was just at a naturalization ceremony 2 weeks ago, and I've been going for a number of years. There used to be about 50 new citizens at these, things, and they take place frequently in the courthouse over in Greenbelt. There were only 35 the last 2 times I've been. I was really curious as to why the number had dropped so dramatically. There was not a white face in the audience, I will say that. These were all countries, goodness, it was amazing, the countries that these people came from. So it's just, is the door being shut, or what?
Yes.
I think anecdotally, even from our own experience working with our refugee family.
Correct.
And the fact that they had turned off the arrivals of people coming from Afghanistan and Iraq who had worked with our troops under SIV. We waited 9 months for a family like that. They didn't arrive. Only 2 arrived over that period of months, was my understanding. And then we did get a family finally from the Congo, or the other family we're helping, the Gazan family. When they received permission to stay in the US to pursue their asylum case, they were told 6 to 8 weeks for an interview. Now they're hearing 2 to 3 years.
Yes.
So the whole process is slowed.
It's completely slowed down. And instead, what bothers me is that the administration is very happy to spend billions and take that from building schools on Air Force bases, thank you very much, on an unneeded wall through some of our most sensitive locations in the country, sensitive geographic locations. Instead, that money could be funneled into studying our immigration laws and changing our policies to streamline entry into the country in a variety of ways. But you cannot catch a breath with this administration, where chaos is the norm. And the more that the pot is stirred, the less those of us might be able to focus on what is important. And it's especially important for us as people of faith to step back from the chaos and say, why is this chaos happening today? And find out it's because another indictment has been offered against the Trump family. That sometimes we are diverted from what is important with chaotic news feeds to forget about what is important. We can't let that happen.
Any other questions, comments?
How can the immigrants create fair rules?
How can the immigrants do what?
Create fair rules.
Create their rules?
Create fair rules for immigration, you mean?
Fair, thank you. The immigrants are resources to the creation of fair rules. Immigrants who are undocumented share their experiences with the system that people who are documented or who were born in this country really don't understand. And so they can help by letting us know what is actually happening to them. And we can partner with them because we have the power of the vote, which they do not, in order to inform our elected officials about the realities of the life of the immigrant and the efforts and the paths toward citizenship and residency and protection, so that the rules become more realistic and they are fair. And by having those honest discussions, I believe we can move toward justice for the immigrant.
So hearing, listening is so important in this context.
But the immigrant needs to be brave.
Yes.
They need to show up in places that they might not have wanted to show up. And that's where we, as their partners in this work, need to stand with them.
You use the expression that the administration does certain things for political gain, which suggests that more people are against immigration reform than are for it. I mean, how do we change hearts and minds? It's like if I think of the same-sex marriage movement in this country as an analogy, it's like is fighting for legislation before we've convinced enough people that immigration reform is what we need. Is that the right way to go about it? Like, do we need to change the hearts and minds of people before we fight it on the legislative side?
We need both. This is happening now in grassroots organizations like Congregation Action Network around the country. The CAN is a part of Faith in Action, which came out of the Industrial Areas Foundation work 70 years ago that originated in Chicago. Saul Alinsky trained a lot of grassroots organizers. It's the kind of organizing that Barack Obama cut his teeth on in Chicago. The Faith in Action has broad-based influence throughout the country, the beginning of changing hearts and minds. This is not a top-down effort. It starts with all of us. We who are everyday people leading everyday lives need to talk to our friends and neighbors and say, what do you think about this? Is it important for us to change our immigration laws? I have a friend I work with who's undocumented or who just became documented, and here's how that happened. And here is the nature of that person. Because if we believe the politicization of immigration, we would believe that every undocumented person in this country is a gang member of MS-13 or is a rapist. So, truth.
You have a question?
Tell the truth. Yeah.
You mentioned that Cedar Lane went through a discernment process before it became a sanctuary parish. Could you talk a little bit more about that and some of the challenges that the parish faced?
Back up a little bit to the organizing of Congregation Action Network. Being a sanctuary congregation is easy because you all already fit that definition because you support the immigrant. And you support the immigrant by writing letters, by petitioning, by having your clergy stand up and speak on behalf of justice in the streets and in the halls of elected officials. The final step of support is physical sanctuary, and that discernment process was basically a process of education through conversation and study. And we spent 5 months in that process, and part of it was the study group using undocumented. That book study group whose conversation entered into the conversation of that congregation as it discerned whether or not to be physical sanctuary. The presence of Aviva Chomsky, pulpit presence, and like you're doing this fall, talking about justice in general. We focused on immigrant justice in a number of ways over that period of time. We had talkbacks after services. It's all led up to a special congregational meeting in May of 2017, at which time the congregation voted up or down on physical sanctuary. It was a near unanimous vote. We had the space, we had the heart, we knew we had the support of the entire network should we have a guest tomorrow. And we began our work then to live out our values, live out our truths, and live out what we viewed as justice for the immigrant by hosting an immigrant sanctuary guest. So it's a lot of more details, but I'd be happy to share it with you another time.
Well, we're right up against our deadline, but very quickly, I understand you have many partners in other congregations that support the work you're doing in offering physical sanctuary. What are some of the things that other congregations do to help support that work?
It's huge. Our master volunteer list has 290 names on it. Any given day, it takes about a dozen people to support Rosa directly for a number of reasons, in order to provide hospitality, comfort, and security. And because of the nature of our property, Rosa has a companion at all times. That changes off and on, but now that the kids are with us, we've kind of backed up and have kept our security in place. And plus, they have to walk to the school bus and back every day.
They're American citizens. Right?
They're U.S. citizens, right, all three of them. The kinds of things people do are varied. We train people to do these tasks twice a month. We just had our last 2 trainings were last week. We have 2 more trainings coming up in October and another 2 in November. Rosa is a major trainer in this work because, of course, it is about her and her family. People run errands and provide food of all sorts to Rosa, so she doesn't have to cook every day in her little kitchen. We bring meals twice a week and do all of her errands. She can't hop in her car and go to the CVS if the kids have a cold, for instance. People companion her around the clock in shifts from 12 to 12 8 to 8 at night, and then during the day, 8 to 12, 12 to 4, and 4 to 8. People engage her children in unique ways, since Rosa can't go out, and take them on outings, spend time with them. We're starting a new study buddy system where every day after school, Monday through Thursday, we'll have people come for an hour to simply be homework assistants. We also have, Rosa has English language tutors, 90 minutes a day, 5 days a week, and we have a need for those as well. Right now, we have 27 congregations and progressive civic groups supporting direct support to Cedar Lane's Sanctuary for Rosa program. In our network, we have about 75 congregations, and that number is growing every day because the need gets greater and greater. So if you're interested, I'll send Ann the link and she'll let you know when our next trainings are. It would be great because you're geographically proximate to Cedar Lane if any of you wanted to participate. We're in it to win it, but it is not a sprint. This is a marathon, and we need as many people to give us a break as possible, and the us is people from all the other congregations as well. I saw a hand back there.
Just really quickly, is the buildings she's living in the sanctuary or else?
By virtue of the Memorandum of Understanding from 2011, houses of worship and their properties are sensitive locations. So Rosa has protection from any ice intrusion on our nearly 7 acres. She can take a walk in the woods, go up nearly to the sidewalk and wave goodbye to her children, and be on the playground and be in any of the buildings or driveways or parking lots throughout the property. Many of you have been to Cedar Lane for big events, so you know it's a big property.
Well, I want to thank you, Charlene, for taking your time and coming this morning and sharing all this information with us. And I know Charlene would be happy to answer any further questions if anyone has them after this. But
sure,
we're running to the next.
But you're on.
Yeah, I'm on. So.
I appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you. Wonderful.